What would you do if you saw someone in need on a stormy night? Would you rush to help, or would you turn them away, assuming the worst? For one police officer, a single decision would lead to consequences he never imagined, shattering his perception of justice and forcing him to confront his own prejudice. The rain fell in relentless sheets, drenching the quiet suburban streets. A lone figure stumbled through the storm, clutching his side, his breath shallow and labored. Blood seeped through his torn shirt, mixing with the rain, as he desperately knocked on the nearest door. Light flickered inside, but no one answered. His voice, hoarse and broken, called out for help, but the night swallowed his pleas. Not far away, Officer Martin Hayes sat in his patrol car, the radio crackling with a call about an injured black man seeking assistance. Hayes leaned back in his seat, glancing out at the rain-soaked streets with disinterest. "Probably up to no good," he muttered under his breath, turning the volume down. To him, it was just another routine disturbance, not worth his time. The man staggered to the next house, his strength fading. Each step felt heavier than the last, but he refused to give up. As the patrol car finally approached, a faint glimmer of hope flickered in his eyes. But Hayes didn't step out. He rolled down the window slightly, his expression cold and skeptical. "What's your story?" he asked, his tone making it clear he didn't expect to believe it. What happened next would set off a chain of events neither man could have anticipated. Events that would lay bare the deep cracks in a system built on judgment and bias, and change their lives forever. The morning light crept through the blinds of Officer Martin Hayes's modest home, casting long shadows across the living room. Hayes sat at the dining table, finishing his coffee in silence, his uniform neatly pressed and his badge polished. A man of discipline and routine, Hayes prided himself on his years of service in law enforcement. He believed he understood the world, its dangers, and the people who posed them. In his mind, criminals had a certain look, a certain way about them. Over the years, this belief had hardened into something unspoken but deeply ingrained, a lens through which he viewed every person he encountered on the job. Upstairs, his teenage son Ethan was still in bed, headphones over his ears, music blasting loud enough to leak into the hallway. Ethan and Hayes barely spoke these days. They used to be closer when Ethan was younger, but somewhere along the way, the connection had frayed. Hayes chalked it up to typical teenage rebellion, though a small part of him wondered if his long hours and stern demeanor had pushed Ethan away. He'd often catch himself thinking, "I'm doing this for him, to keep him safe." But as the distance between them grew, he wasn't sure Ethan saw it that way. The precinct was its usual hive of activity when Hayes arrived. Phones rang incessantly, officers exchanged quick greetings, and the faint smell of burnt coffee hung in the air. Hayes navigated the chaos with practiced ease, nodding at familiar faces as he headed to his desk. To his colleagues, he was the kind of cop who got the job done, efficient, reliable, and unapologetically by the book. But there was a quiet undercurrent of tension whenever Hayes was around. Some of the younger officers whispered about his old-school mindset, while others respected his unwavering adherence to the rules. "Morning, Hayes," Detective Williams called from across the room, raising a cup of coffee. Williams was one of the few people in the precinct who ever challenged Hayes on his worldview. A black man who had grown up in the very neighborhoods they patrolled, Williams had seen firsthand the complexities of the community, the struggles, and the humanity that often went unnoticed. "Morning," Hayes replied curtly, setting down his files. The day progressed like any other. Paperwork, patrols, responding to minor disturbances. But something about that day felt heavier, though Hayes couldn't quite place it. Maybe it was the conversation he'd overheard in the break room earlier, where Williams had mentioned the importance of treating everyone with dignity, no matter their background. Hayes had rolled his eyes at the sentiment, dismissing it as overly idealistic. Across town, the man who would later cross paths with Hayes was busy at work. His name was Desmond Carter, and he was a youth mentor at a local community center. Desmond had grown up in the same neighborhood he now worked to uplift, dedicating his time to helping kids avoid the pitfalls he had narrowly escaped. He always organized after-school programs, tutoring sessions, and basketball games, always striving to be the role model he wished he'd had growing up. Desmond's reputation in the community was stellar, but he wasn't blind to the way people like him were perceived outside his neighborhood. He'd been stopped by police more times than he could count. often for nothing more than walking home late at night. Each encounter left a bitter taste in his mouth, a reminder of how the world often saw him not as a mentor, a leader, or a man, but as a suspect. That evening, Desmond stayed late at the community center, cleaning up after a group of kids who had just finished a game. By the time he left, the streets were quiet, the only sounds coming from distant traffic and the occasional bark of a dog. He didn't notice the car following him until it was too late. A man jumped out from the shadows, demanding his wallet. Desmond resisted, and a brief struggle ensued. A knife flashed in the dim light, and before Desmond knew it, he was bleeding, his side burning with pain. The attacker fled, leaving him staggering in the middle of the street, clutching his wound. As Desmond stumbled through the neighborhood, knocking on doors, his thoughts raced. Surely someone would help him, but house after house, door after door, he was met with hesitation, suspicion, or complete indifference. His calls for help echoed into the night, unanswered. Meanwhile, Hayes sat in his patrol car, parked under a street lamp. The rain had started again, tapping against the windshield like a restless drumbeat. When the call came over the radio about an injured man, Hayes hesitated. The address wasn't far, but he'd had a long day, and he didn't feel like dealing with another situation. After a moment's pause, he sighed and started the car. By the time Hayes arrived, Desmond was slumped against a lamp post, his face pale and his breathing shallow. Hayes rolled down the window, his expression unreadable. Desmond raised a shaky hand, his voice barely above a whisper. "Officer, please, I need help." Hayes scanned him from head to toe, his mind racing with assumptions. His instincts told him this wasn't just a random victim. It was someone who had probably gotten involved in something he shouldn't have. After a brief pause, Hayes shook his head. "Stay here. I'll call for backup," he said, his tone detached. But Desmond didn't have time to wait. As Hayes drove off, the storm grew heavier, and Desmond's vision blurred. The faint glow of headlights in the distance was the only thing keeping him conscious. Little did Hayes know, the decision he made that night would not only haunt him, but also force him to confront the very biases he had spent his life denying. The storm continued to rage as Desmond Carter sat slumped against a lamppost, rain mixing with the blood seeping through his fingers. His body felt like it was shutting down, his thoughts clouded by pain and exhaustion. The officer who had promised to call for backup was gone, and the street was eerily quiet once more. Desmond's hope flickered dangerously low. If he didn't get help soon, he wasn't sure how much longer he could hold on. Several blocks away, Officer Hayes pulled into the precinct parking lot, the windshield wipers squeaking against the glass as the rain slowed. The image of the man on the sidewalk lingered in his mind, but he brushed it off. He'll be fine once someone else gets there, he told himself, shutting off the engine. His shift was nearly over, and the idea of heading back out into the storm for what he saw as another street squabble didn't appeal to him. Inside, Hayes turned in his paperwork, nodding briefly at Detective Williams, who was busy at his desk. Williams barely looked up as Hayes walked past, his focus on a stack of files in front of him. Among them was a report about a recent uptick in violent robberies in a nearby neighborhood. Williams had been working tirelessly to piece together the puzzle, but so far the perpetrators had remained elusive. As Hayes prepared to head home, Williams's phone rang. A frown creased his brow as he listened to the caller on the other end. "An injured man left alone at the scene," Williams repeated, his voice growing sharp. "And no responding officer stayed with him?" His eyes flicked toward Hayes, but he said nothing further. Hanging up the phone, Williams grabbed his jacket and headed out, leaving Hayes with an unsettling sense of unease. Back on the street, Desmond finally saw another car approaching, a sleek black sedan this time. Relief coursed through him, though his instincts warned him to remain cautious. The car slowed to a stop, and two men stepped out. They weren't police officers. Their heavy jackets and the way they moved suggested something far more dangerous. Desmond's pulse quickened as one of the men approached, pulling out a phone and snapping a picture of him. "You've got guts, man," the man said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Fighting back wasn't the smartest move. Desmond realized then that these men weren't just random strangers. They were connected to the man who had attacked him earlier. He had become a target, and now they were here to ensure he didn't get the chance to tell anyone what he'd seen. Summoning the last reserves of his strength, Desmond pushed himself to his feet and staggered toward an alley. The men followed, their voices taunting him as he weaved through the narrow passageways. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew he couldn't stop. Meanwhile, Williams arrived at the scene, his headlights cutting through the rain as he parked near the lamppost where Desmond had been. But the spot was empty now, the only evidence of what had happened being a faint smear of blood on the ground. Williams radioed for additional units and began canvassing the area, his mind racing. At the precinct, Hayes sat in the break room, scrolling through his phone. A notification popped up on the department group chat, a call for backup in the same area he'd just left. For a moment, he considered ignoring it, but something about the message gave him pause. He thought of the injured man, the desperation in his voice. What if no one else shows up in time? The thought gnawed at him, but Hayes quickly shoved it aside. Not my problem anymore. As Hayes tried to shake off the beacony unease, his phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't a work notification. It was a message from his wife. "Ethan didn't come home after school. Have you heard from him?" A cold wave of panic washed over Hayes. He immediately tried calling his son's phone, but it went straight to voicemail. Anxiety gripped him as he thought of the stories he'd heard. Kids getting caught up in the wrong crowds, being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Hayes decided to head back out, his earlier fatigue forgotten. His mind raced as he drove, scanning the streets for any sign of his son. He called Ethan's friends, but none of them had seen him. As the hours ticked by, Hayes's professional detachment began to crumble, replaced by the raw fear of a father whose child was missing. Elsewhere, Desmond had managed to evade his pursuers, collapsing behind a dumpster in an alleyway. His breaths came in shallow gasps, his vision blurred. He fumbled for his phone, dialing the first number he could think of, the community center director. "Desmond, is that you?" the voice on the other end asked, alarmed. "I need help," Desmond managed to say before the phone slipped from his grasp. The director immediately called 911, reporting Desmond's location and condition. Williams, who was still canvassing nearby, picked up the call and rushed to the scene. When he found Desmond, the man was barely conscious, but he managed to whisper something that sent chills down Williams' spine. "They're still out there." Watching, Williams called for an ambulance and stayed with Desmond, his mind working overtime. The pieces of the robbery case he'd been investigating were beginning to come together. He realized that Desmond wasn't just a victim, he was a witness to something much larger. As Hayes circled the streets, he finally spotted Ethan's bike, abandoned near a park. His heart sank as he got out of the car, flashlight in hand. Nearby, he heard voices, low and threatening. He followed the sound, his steps quickening as he drew closer. To his horror, he saw Ethan surrounded by a group of older teens, their intentions clear. Hayes shouted, drawing his weapon as he approached. The group scattered, leaving Ethan shaken but unharmed. Hayes pulled his son into a tight embrace, relief flooding him. But Ethan pulled away, anger in his eyes. "Why weren't you there earlier?" he demanded. "You're supposed to protect people. Isn't that your job?" The words hit Hayes like a punch to the gut. In that moment, he saw himself through Ethan's eyes, not as a protector, but as someone who had failed to act when it mattered most. When Hayes returned to the precinct with Ethan, he learned about Desmond's ordeal and the investigation Williams was now leading. Hayes listened quietly as Williams laid out the connections between the recent robberies and the attack on Desmond. "Desmond could have died out there tonight," Williams said, his tone sharp. "And he almost did, because someone didn't think he was worth helping." The room fell silent, and Hayes felt the weight of those words settle heavily on his shoulders. For the first time, he couldn't dismiss the nagging voice in his head, the one telling him that his indifference had consequences. What Hayes didn't yet realize was that the same men who had attacked Desmond were tied to a larger network, one that had ensnared more people than he could imagine. And as the investigation unfolded, he would come face to face with the reality of his own biases and the impact they had not just on strangers, but on his own family. The storm outside had subsided, but for Hayes, the real tempest was just beginning. Desmond Carter woke to the sterile brightness of a hospital room. His side throbbed and his throat was dry, but he was alive. Detective Williams stood at the foot of the bed, a serious expression on his face. "You're lucky to be here," Williams said, his voice steady. "The paramedics said another hour out there, and it could have been a different story." Desmond nodded weakly, grateful for the help, but haunted by the events of the night. "The men who attacked me," he began, his voice hoarse. "They're part of something bigger. They know I saw their faces." Williams leaned in. "We're working on it. But I need your help, Desmond. Anything you can remember. Details, descriptions. It's critical." Desmond hesitated, his mind replaying the events in sharp flashes. There was a tattoo," he said finally. "A snake coiled around a dagger on one guy's neck. And they mentioned something about closing loose ends." Williams nodded, scribbling in his notebook. "That's enough to get started." Meanwhile, at the precinct, Officer Hayes sat at his desk, staring at the glowing computer screen. The events of the night weighed heavily on him. Desmond's desperate eyes, the blood-soaked sidewalk, and Ethan's cutting words. His decision to leave the scene was now impossible to ignore, especially after hearing how close Desmond had come to death. Hayes glanced up as Williams stormed into the precinct, a sense of urgency radiating from him. "Hayes," Williams called, his voice firm, "we need every available officer on this. We've got a lead on the men responsible for the robberies and the attack on Desmond Carter." Hayes hesitated. The guilt gnawed at him, but he was also eager for redemption. "What do you need?" Williams handed him a file. "This is bigger than we thought. These guys are running an operation. Smuggling, theft, and intimidation. And they don't leave witnesses." The briefing room filled quickly as officers gathered. Williams laid out the plan. They'd identified a hideout based on Desmond's description and previous intelligence. It was a warehouse on the edge of town, isolated but active. Their mission was clear: secure the area, apprehend the suspects, and ensure no one else got hurt. As the team prepared to leave, Hayes caught Williams's eye. "Let me lead the approach," Hayes said. His voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of determination. "I owe it to him." Williams studied Hayes for a moment before nodding. "Stay sharp. These guys are dangerous." The convoy of police vehicles rolled out under the cover of night, their sirens silent to avoid alerting the suspects. Hayes drove in silence, his mind racing. He thought about Desmond, the man he had abandoned, and Ethan, who now looked at him with disdain. He knew this was more than just another operation. It was his chance to make things right, even if he couldn't erase the past. The warehouse loomed ahead, its broken windows glowing faintly from the light inside. Officers fanned out, positioning themselves around the perimeter. Hayes, leading the front team, approached the entrance. He signaled for two officers to flank him, their weapons drawn. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of oil and dust. Hayes could hear voices. Yeah, a heated argument. He crept closer, the beam of his flashlight slicing through the darkness. The suspects were gathered around a table, counting money and sorting stolen goods. Hayes's breath caught as he recognized the man with the snake and dagger tattoo. This was it. The leader of the group, the one Desmond had described. "Police! Hands up!" Hayes shouted, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. The men froze for a split second before chaos erupted. One of them lunged for a weapon, but Hayes reacted instinctively, firing a warning shot that echoed through the warehouse. The suspect dropped the gun, his hands shooting into the air. "Don't be stupid," Hayes barked. "You're surrounded." The suspects hesitated, glancing at each other, weighing their options. But the sound of officers closing in from the rear entrance made their choice clear. Slowly, they raised their hands. As the team secured the suspects and began cataloging evidence, Hayes caught sight of something that made his stomach drop. A phone left on the table, its screen still lit. On it was a photo of Desmond, bloodied and slumped against a lamppost. "We were watching him," Hayes muttered, his voice tight. He turned to Williams, who had just entered the room. "Desmond here's not safe," Hayes said urgently. "If they took this picture, they're not done with him." Williams nodded grimly. "We'll double security at the hospital, but we need to get him into protective custody. These guys don't leave loose ends." As the suspects were loaded into police vans, Hayes felt a flicker of relief, but it was short-lived. This wasn't just about catching criminals anymore. It was about ensuring Desmond survived long enough to see justice served. Back at the hospital, Desmond stirred as Hayes entered the room. Their eyes met, and for a moment, neither spoke. Hayes began, but the words caught in his throat. He wasn't sure what he wanted to say. Desmond's expression was unreadable, but his voice was steady. "You left me," Hayes nodded, the weight of the admission crushing him. "I did. And I was wrong. I didn't see you for who you are, and that nearly cost you your life." Desmond studied him for a long moment before speaking. "What matters is what you do now. Not just for me, but for the next person who needs you." Hayes swallowed hard, his chest tight with emotion. "I'm going to make this right," he promised. The next day, Hayes stood in front of the precinct's leadership team alongside Williams. Together, they presented the evidence gathered at the warehouse linking the suspects to a series of violent crimes. Hayes pushed for more than arrests. He advocated for a partnership with community leaders like Desmond to address the root causes of crime and rebuild trust between law enforcement and the neighborhoods they served. Williams, impressed by Hayes's change in attitude, supported the initiative. "It's time we listen," he said firmly, "not just to statistics, but to the people we're sworn to protect." For Hayes, the road ahead wasn't easy. He couldn't undo the harm he'd caused, but he could use his position to make sure others didn't face the same indifference. As he drove home that night, he glanced at Ethan, who sat quietly in the passenger's seat. "I made a mistake," Hayes said, breaking the silence, "but I'm going to do better. For you. For everyone." Ethan looked at his father, a hint of understanding softening his features. "Just don't forget the people who need you, Dad," he said. The storm had passed, but its lessons lingered. For Hayes, the journey to redemption had just begun, and this time he was determined to walk the right path, one step at a time. In the weeks following the arrests, Desmond Carter slowly recovered, both physically and emotionally. The community center rallied around him, celebrating his bravery and determination to stand up against those who sought to silence him. His testimony became a key factor in dismantling the criminal operation, ensuring that the suspects faced justice. Officer Hayes, deeply changed by the events, took a step he never imagined. He reached out to Desmond, not just to apologize, but to listen. Together, they began facilitating open dialogues between the police department and the local community, addressing the tensions that had long simmered beneath the surface. Hayes was no longer just an officer. He was becoming an advocate for change, determined to bridge the divide he once ignored. The precinct, spurred by the momentum, implemented training focused on recognizing and combating implicit bias. Detective Williams championed the changes, ensuring they weren't just performative, but deeply rooted in the department's culture. Desmond, now a visible leader in his community, used his platform to push for systemic reforms. He often spoke at public forums, sharing his story and emphasizing the power of resilience and accountability. For Hayes, the impact was personal. His relationship with his son, Ethan, began to heal as he demonstrated what it meant to truly take responsibility. And for the community, Desmond's survival and Hayes' transformation symbolized hope, that even in the face of deep prejudice, change was possible. The story left an undeniable mark, inspiring conversations across the city about justice, equality, and the courage to do what's right. It became clear one act of courage could spark a ripple effect, proving that even flawed systems could be challenged and ultimately reformed. Desmond Carter's story is a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit and the power of accountability. It reveals that systemic injustice doesn't just persist because of bad actors, but often because of indifference, the kind of indifference that almost cost Desmond his life. But it also shows us that change is possible when people are willing to confront their own biases and take action to build a better world. This is more than just one man's story. It's a call to all of us. How often do we overlook those in need or fail to challenge the systems that perpetuate harm? How often do we choose the easy path instead of the right one? Now is the time to ask ourselves the hard questions. How can we ensure that stories like Desmond's are no longer the norm, but the exception? How can we hold our institutions accountable while also building trust and understanding in our communities? We challenge you to take the next step. Educate yourself about racial bias and systemic inequities. Speak up when you witness injustice, no matter how small it may seem. Advocate for reform in your local communities, whether through policy change, public dialogue, or grassroots action. And most importantly, share this story. Let Desmond's journey inspire others to reflect, act, and push for a more just society. What are your thoughts? Have you or someone you know faced a similar experience? Share your story in the comments. Let's keep this conversation going and be part of the solution. Together, we can ensure that no one is left behind and the promise of justice is truly equal for all. The time for change is now. What will you do?